No one could understand what was happening to her. For months, the kingdom had felt an odd tension emanating from the heart of the palace. All eyes were on her, the queen, who seemed to be fading with every passing day, slipping further into her own thoughts. But they didn't know the most important thing, and no one dared to ask. She stood before the statue, her long gown trailing on the floor like ocean waves, her eyes full of madness, fixed on the emptiness. She was speaking to it. In the silence of the empty hall beneath the grand arches of the palace, her voice sounded like music, sweet yet hauntingly unsettling. "Can you hear me, can't you?" She spoke, her words falling on the stone surface, but they felt alive. "You are everything I've ever wanted, and I can't live without you anymore." The courtiers standing in the shadowed corners exchanged worried glances. They could hear her, but could not understand. How long had this been going on? How long had the queen been standing here, speaking to a statue as if it could respond? Her breath caught as she ran a trembling hand along the cold marble, almost as if searching for a pulse. Her gaze softened, and a fleeting smile danced on her lips. "You understand, don't you? You feel it too." But no one responded. The sound of a distant bell echoed throughout the castle, calling the kingdom to another meeting, another royal decision that would forever change the course of their lives. But the queen, she stood still, entranced. Her eyes never left the statue. Her voice was the only sound. "Why does no one understand, my love? Why does no one see the truth?" The courtiers in silence bowed their heads. It was too late to intervene. The queen's madness had begun, but none of them knew how deep it would go. What do you think? Is the queen truly in love, or is something more sinister at play? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to find out what happens next. The queen's obsession deepened with each passing day. The palace became her sanctuary, and the statue her only companion. She no longer attended the grand feasts or the royal meetings, her duties slipping away unnoticed. The whispers of her behavior echoed through the halls, but no one dared to speak openly. The courtiers, the nobles, the servants, they all kept their distance, unsure of how to handle the fragile, unraveling monarch. Every morning the queen would stand before the statue, her eyes wide with feverish intensity. She spoke to it as if it were alive, her voice soft and filled with a longing that bordered on desperation. "Why do they keep me away from you? Why do they not see? You are all I need, all I've ever wanted. Don't they know that?" Her servants had long since stopped trying to intervene. The queen had shut herself away from the world, and no one knew how to reach her. Her obsession wasn't just mental, it was physical too. Her skin had paled, her eyes hollowed out. She no longer ate proper meals, surviving only on fruit and water, taking sustenance when she could remember to. Her hair, once beautifully done, now hung loosely, untamed and unkempt. The servants noticed that the more she stared at the statue, the more she seemed to slip into a world that wasn't their own. She would sometimes laugh softly to herself, as though the statue had spoken to her, as though it had responded. Other times she would burst into fits of rage, shouting at the cold, unyielding stone. "You are real, you must be. You understand me." Her anger would then dissipate as quickly as it came, and she would collapse in front of the statue, sobbing uncontrollably, as though the weight of her feelings was too much for her fragile mind to bear. It wasn't long before the palace staff began to question whether the queen was truly losing her mind, or if there was something more sinister at play. Some whispered that the statue was cursed, that it had taken hold of her in some way. Others believed that the queen had been bewitched, her mind poisoned by a dark magic they didn't understand. But no one dared to approach her. No one dared to disturb the queen in her trance. Then one day, something shifted. The queen stood in front of the statue, her hands trembling as she traced the lines of its face, her fingers lingering on the cold stone. She whispered words so quietly that even her most loyal servants couldn't hear. "Please, speak to me." And then, as if in answer to her desperate plea, a faint echo of her voice seemed to respond. It wasn't the statue speaking, not in any conventional sense, but for a moment the queen swore she heard the faintest whisper in her ear, soft like a breeze through the trees. "I'm here. I'm always here." Her breath hitched, and she turned to face the room, her wide eyes full of terror and awe. "Did you hear that?" she cried, her voice frantic, her body shaking. "Did you hear it? The voice. It spoke to me. I knew it. I knew you were alive." But there was no one there. No one had heard it. The courtiers who had dared to come closer now backed away, terrified. They exchanged worried glances, their hands shaking. Was the queen truly hearing voices, or was this simply the final unraveling of her mind? Is the queen truly hearing voices, or is her mind playing cruel tricks on her? What do you think? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for the next part of this twisted tale. The rumors around the queen's madness spread like wildfire, yet the world continued to spin. Kingdoms waged wars, merchants traded in the bustling markets, and the sun rose and set over the lands. But inside the royal palace, everything had come to a halt. There were no more grand dinners, no more celebrations. The court had transformed into a place of fear, of confusion, as courtiers tiptoed around a fragile queen who seemed both lost and consumed by a love that no one else could understand. Every morning without fail, she would stand before the statue, her pale face illuminated by the soft light of the dawn. Her gaze was so intense it seemed to burn holes through the stone. She would talk to it as though it were a living, breathing person, as though it could respond to her every word. "You are my perfect creation, my masterpiece," she would whisper, her voice filled with reverence. "No one will ever understand you the way I do. They will never see the beauty that I see in you. You were made for me, for us." The statue had become more than just an object of affection to her. It had become a symbol of something far greater. The queen, in her delusion, believed that it represented everything she had ever wanted: beauty, perfection, an unattainable ideal. But her obsession was no longer limited to the physical. She saw it as her partner, a soul bound to her, created for her and her alone. The kingdom had always praised her as a woman of great intellect and charm. But now she was different. Her once sharp and confident mind had dulled. She had retreated into a world where the boundaries of reality and fantasy were blurred. She spent her nights in the dim glow of candles, sketching the statue in every possible pose, every angle, every shadow that danced on its surface. Her art had taken on a new life. Each sketch seemed to grow more lifelike, more animated, as though the statue were moving in the delicate strokes of her quill. It was as if she were capturing its very soul on paper. Some of the courtiers who had been brave enough to enter her chambers spoke in hushed tones about the beauty of her drawings. But there was something unsettling about them too. The way the statue's eyes seemed to follow you, the slight curve of its lips that suggested a hidden smile. These were details that made even the bravest of them shiver. But it was the queen's obsession with her art that truly worried the palace. Her sketches were no longer just representations of the statue. They began to feature a darker twist, a longing in the eyes of the statue, a connection that went beyond the stone. The queen had started to draw herself beside it, to entwine her body with the statue's, to imagine herself wrapped in its cold embrace. One night, as she sat in the dim light of her private chambers, a thought crossed her mind. Perhaps the statue wasn't merely a piece of art. Perhaps with enough willpower, she could bring it to life. She had read stories of artists who breathed life into their works. She had heard whispers of gods and mortals, of lovers and miracles. Wasn't it possible? Could she not make her perfect creation real? In her fevered state, she decided to take the first step. She instructed her servants to gather all the rarest and most precious oils and paints. She ordered the finest artisans in the kingdom to craft a potion, a mixture that, in her mind, would breathe life into the cold marble. Tonight, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with anticipation. Tonight, you will be mine in every way. Her servants watched in disbelief as she carefully painted the statue, her hands trembling with each stroke. The oils and powders seemed to glow under the flickering candlelight, casting strange, unnatural shadows across the room. The queen was lost in her work, her movements erratic, her breathing shallow. To anyone else, it might have seemed like the final descent into madness. But to the queen, it was the culmination of her dream, the moment she had waited for. As the night wore on, she fell into a trance, her hands never stopping, as if guided by some unseen force. She continued painting, her thoughts consumed by the idea of merging with the statue, of uniting with her perfect creation. But then something began to change. The temperature in the room dropped. The candles flickered as though a sudden draft had swept through the chamber. The queen paused, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment she felt a presence behind her, a presence she couldn't explain, but one that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She turned around slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, and for the briefest moment her eyes met the eyes of the statue. They seemed to glow. The marble had taken on a different hue, a warmth she had never seen before. It was as though the statue had come to life, as though her love had been answered. "Do you see me?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Do you finally see me?" Her hands shook as she reached out to touch the statue, but just as her fingers brushed the cool marble, the room seemed to shift. A loud crash echoed through the palace, followed by the unmistakable sound of stone grinding against stone. The queen stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The statue, it moved. For just an instant, she thought she saw its lips curl upward, forming a smile. A smile meant only for her. But then the moment passed. The statue returned to its original form, motionless, silent, cold. The queen fell to her knees, her heart hammering in her chest. Had she imagined it? Had her mind played a cruel trick on her? "No," she whispered to herself, shaking her head, as though trying to shake the hallucination from her mind. "It was real. It was real. You spoke to me." But deep down the queen knew. She knew she was losing her grip on reality. The statue had never moved. It was all in her mind. But in that brief instant, she had believed. And that belief was enough to send her spiraling deeper into her obsession. What did the queen experience in that moment? Was it a sign, or was her mind finally unraveling? Let us know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more of this twisted story. As the days passed, the queen's obsession grew stronger. more palpable. It was no longer enough to gaze at the statue, or to paint it, or even to speak to it. She felt an overwhelming need to become one with it, to transcend the boundaries of her own existence and merge with her perfect creation. The thought of any world where the statue didn't exist alongside her was unbearable. And so she began to take more extreme measures. Every night, after the palace had gone silent, after the last of the candles had flickered out, she would sneak into the royal garden, the moonlight casting long, twisted shadows across the marble floors. There she would sit beneath the statue, her hands trembling as they traced the contours of its form, as if hoping to feel something other than cold stone. But tonight, there was something different in the air. The garden felt heavier, as if the night itself had become a living entity, a creature stalking her every move. The scent of the flowers seemed to take on a strange, sickly sweetness, and the wind no longer carried the soft whispers of nature. Instead, it seemed to speak to her in a language she could not understand, a language filled with grief and longing. The queen's breath quickened. She could feel it now, the presence of something in the air, something more than just her own madness. For hours she sat before the statue, talking to it in hushed tones, pleading with it as though it were her lover, her salvation, her only hope in a world that had abandoned her. "You are everything to me," she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You are all I need, all I want. You are perfect. No one will ever love you like I do. No one could possibly understand you the way I do." Her hands shook as she reached up to touch the statue's face once more, her fingers running over the cold, unyielding surface. She closed her eyes, lost in the sensation of it, her body trembling with the intensity of her longing. And then, as if the universe itself had decided to grant her wish, she felt something different, a slight tremor, like the pulse of life. The stone seemed to warm under her touch, and for the briefest of moments, the queen thought she could hear a soft sigh, as though the statue were breathing. Her eyes snapped open. For a split second, the figure before her seemed alive. The marble shone with a new light, almost like a living being caught between worlds. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood up, her legs shaking beneath her. "Please, please," she whispered desperately, "don't leave me. I need you. I need you to be real." But as quickly as the moment had come, it vanished. The statue was still. The night was still. Everything was as it had been before. The queen stood there, frozen in shock, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Was it real? Had she imagined it? Was the magic she had been seeking so long finally reaching out to her? "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why won't you love me back? Why won't you speak to me?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but she did not wipe them away. Instead, she stood there in the cold, feeling as if she had lost something more important than her mind, something more precious than her heart. Her love for the statue had become her entire world, and now it was slipping through her fingers like sand. And that was when she heard it. A voice, not her own, but a soft, distant whisper that seemed to echo in the very air around her. "You are not alone." Her blood ran cold. The queen spun around, her breath catching in her throat. No one stood behind her. No one was in the garden with her. But the voice, it had been there. It had spoken to her. The darkness of the night seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on her, suffocating her. The queen stumbled backward, her eyes darting around the garden. She felt as though she were being watched, stalked by something unseen, something that had been hiding in the shadows for far too long. Who is there? Annikar, she cried out, her voice trembling. Who spoke? There was no answer. The silence that followed was oppressive. The queen's pulse quickened as she looked desperately around, her mind racing. Had she finally lost all touch with reality? Had her obsession with the statue pushed her beyond the point of no return? She couldn't understand what was happening. She couldn't explain the voice, or the warmth in the stone, or the cold chill that now wrapped around her heart. She only knew one thing. The statue, her love, her perfect creation, was not the only thing in this world that could speak to her. Something else was here. The queen's mind raced as she struggled to grasp the full weight of her thoughts. Was the statue truly alive? Had she somehow awakened it? Or was something darker, something more sinister at work? But the voice that had spoken to her had not come from the statue. It had come from the darkness itself. What do you think? Who or what was speaking to the queen? Was it a sign, or is her mind breaking completely? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for the next part of this twisted tale. The queen could no longer deny the truth. Her mind was slipping away. What had once been an innocent obsession had become a dangerous descent into madness. She could no longer tell what was real and what was merely a product of her fevered imagination. Each day she spent in the palace, each hour spent in the garden, only seemed to twist her perception of reality further. The boundaries between what she wanted and what was happening were disintegrating, and with them, her sense of self. The voice, the voice she had heard in the garden, still echoed in her mind. It had been soft, like a whisper in the wind, but it had been real. She was sure of it. Something, someone, was out there watching her, pulling her deeper into the web of her madness. Every night she returned to the statue, searching for answers. But no matter how much time she spent with it, no matter how much she poured her heart out, it remained cold, silent, unmoving. Yet she could feel it watching her. It was as though its eyes had become more than just lifeless stone. There was something in them, something that seemed to see her, to know her, and that terrified her more than anything. The queen became more erratic with each passing day. She spent hours in front of the statue, pleading with it, crying out for it to speak, to come to life, to be real. But it remained still, its expression frozen in eternal silence. But then, as the days wore on, the queen began to notice something. The statue, her perfect creation, was beginning to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, its features seemed to shift. The angle of its face, the curve of its lips, the position of its arms. Everything seemed to move just slightly, as if responding to her every desire. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a product of her tired eyes. But as the changes grew more pronounced, she became convinced. The statue was alive. It was responding to her, answering her calls. The love she had longed for, the passion she had poured into it, was being returned. Her madness had reached its peak. One night, as she sat in front of the statue, her fingers trembling as they traced its features, she whispered, "Please, I need you. I need you to be with me, to be real. I can't live without you any longer." And then something happened that made her blood run cold. The statue's eyes seemed to blink. She gasped, stumbling backward, her heart racing in her chest. She reached out for the statue again, her hands shaking. She could feel the heat of her touch against the cold stone, the pulse of life, the beating heart of her creation. But just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The statue was still. The warmth was gone. The queen's breath hitched as she realized the truth. Her mind had broken. She was no longer in control of her thoughts, her feelings, her very perception of reality. Everything she had believed, everything she had felt, had become a twisted reflection of her own delusions. And now she was trapped in a world of her own making. "Why won't you come to me?" she cried, her voice breaking. "Why won't you love me back? Why won't you live for me?" Her words were met with silence. The statue stood still, unmoving, as cold and lifeless as it had always been. But in that silence, in the stillness of the night, the queen heard something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper in the darkness. "Because you don't deserve me." The queen froze. The voice was not hers. It was deeper, darker, filled with a coldness that sent chills down her spine. It was the voice she had heard in the garden. The voice that had been following her, stalking her, waiting for her to lose herself completely. She spun around, her heart racing in her chest, but no one was there. The garden was empty. The room was empty. Only the statue stood before her, its eyes still fixed on her, unmoving. "Who, who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. There was no answer, only silence. But the queen knew now. The statue wasn't her creation. It was a prison, a trap she had woven for herself, a reflection of her deepest desires and fears. It was never meant to be her lover, her salvation. It was meant to destroy her. And now it was too late to escape. Her body shook as she realized the full extent of her madness. She had spent so long searching for something outside of herself, something to love, to hold, to fill the void in her heart, that she had lost everything. She had lost herself. In a desperate fit of rage and grief, she approached the statue once more, her eyes wide with a crazed determination. "I will make you love me," she shouted, her voice hoarse and wild. "I will force you to love me." Her hands gripped the statue's shoulders, shaking it, pulling at it, as if trying to free it from its stone prison. But no matter how hard she tried, the statue remained unmoved, unyielding. And that was when she realized the truth. The statue was not her salvation. It was her destruction. The queen has lost everything: her mind, her kingdom, and her sanity. What happens next? Is she doomed to spiral further into darkness? Comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to continue following this tragic tale. Days blurred into nights, and the queen's descent into madness grew more rapid, more frantic. The kingdom had long since fallen into disarray. Her once beautiful and opulent palace had become a prison of stone, darkness, and delusion. The courtiers who had once adored her for her wisdom and strength now whispered among themselves, fearful of what she had become. They had seen their queen's mental state deteriorate, seen her become consumed by a love for something that didn't exist, for something that could never love her back. But none of them had the courage to approach her, to pull her from the depths of her obsession. And so she continued. The queen would spend her days locked away in the royal chambers, surrounded by her drawings, her sketches, her half-finished paintings. Every inch of the walls was covered in images of the statue, its cold, lifeless form twisting in various poses, contorted in ways that made the paintings feel alive, but just barely. The queen's obsession had turned into an art form, a desperate attempt to hold on to something that could never be hers. But no matter how much she painted, no matter how many hours she spent in front of the statue, she could never shake the emptiness that gnawed at her soul. The warmth she had once felt, the connection she had believed existed between them, was gone. All that remained was cold stone, silent and indifferent to her love. Her nights were spent in restless sleep, her dreams haunted by the voice that had first whispered to her in the garden. It taunted her, mocked her, telling her she was unworthy, telling her she would never be loved, telling her that all of this was her doing, her fault. You are nothing, it whispered. You were always alone. Each night the queen would wake in a cold sweat, her hands trembling, her heart racing. The voice had grown louder, more insistent, a constant presence in her mind. It was as if the very walls of the palace had absorbed her madness, now echoing her fears back at her. In her waking hours, the queen could no longer tell the difference between the voice of the statue and the voice that came from the shadows. She no longer cared. The two had merged in her mind. Both were a part of her twisted reality, and both were a part of the destruction that was coming. One evening, as the golden rays of the setting sun streamed through the grand windows, the queen sat before the statue again, her fingers gently brushing the stone. She spoke to it, her voice barely audible, her words almost lost in the silence. "You were made for me," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of her desperation. "You are mine. You must be." But the statue did not answer. It never did. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, and for a moment she could almost hear the voice that had tormented her so many times. "You are alone, my queen. You always will be." The words sank deep into her chest, an unbearable truth. She fell to her knees, her face buried in her hands as sobs racked her body. The palace around her seemed to close in, its cold stone walls pressing against her, suffocating her. And then something changed. The queen stood up, her body trembling with newfound determination. Her eyes, wild and unblinking, stared into the cold eyes of the statue. For a moment she seemed to be seeing something different. There was no longer sadness in her eyes, no longer desperation. Now there was only rage. "You never loved me," she hissed, her voice rising. "You used me. All of you used me. My kingdom, my people, my own heart, all of it was a lie." Her hand gripped the statue's stone arm with an almost violent force, and she shook it as if trying to make it react. Her voice, once soft and pleading, had become a scream of fury. "I gave you everything," she screamed, "and you gave me nothing in return. You mocked me all along, didn't you? You—" Her voice faltered, her breath ragged, as her mind raced with the twisted images she had conjured in her fevered state. "You were never real. None of this is real." But the statue remained still, silent, cold. The queen's heart hammered in her chest. She felt as though she might explode, her mind splintering into 1,000 shards of insanity. The statue was her creation, her perfect love, and yet it refused to live for her. It refused to acknowledge her pain. For years she had been seeking something outside of herself, a perfect love, an answer to the emptiness that plagued her soul. And yet in the end, the statue had only become a reflection of her own brokenness. The queen was trapped, not by the stone that had once been her salvation, but by her own delusions. In that moment, a single thought struck her, a thought that terrified her beyond measure. She had to break free. But could she? Could she escape the prison she had built for herself? Or had she been consumed by it forever? The queen turned away from the statue, her eyes wild, her mind spinning in a blur of fear and anger. She walked toward the throne room, her steps heavy, as if each footfall was a declaration of her defiance. And when she reached the throne, she collapsed into it, her body shaking as she reached for the crown that had once symbolized her power. She placed it on her head, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something other than fear, power. Her trembling hand slowly clenched into a fist as she raised it into the air. She had the throne. She had the kingdom. But there was nothing left for her to rule but herself. And that was the most terrifying truth of all. The queen is now alone on her throne. But is she truly in control? Has she finally found the strength to escape her madness? Or will she be consumed by it? What happens next? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to see how her tragic tale unfolds. The corridors of the palace echoed with silence, broken only by the distant murmur of the wind through shattered windows. Queen Eleonora, once the proud ruler of a magnificent kingdom, was now a mere shell of herself. Her mind, once sharp and calculating, had eroded into madness. The halls that had once witnessed her dignified steps now trembled under the weight of her broken soul. Her eyes, sunken and feverish, stared fixedly at the statue in the center of her chamber. It had always been there, but now it was no longer just stone. To her, it had become her lover, her confidant, her everything. There was no difference anymore between the statue and the world she had abandoned. Her obsession had consumed her, and the boundary between reality and fantasy had blurred beyond recognition. The palace had fallen into ruin, as had Eleonora's reign. Her people whispered in hushed tones about their queen, who had stopped ruling long ago. They spoke of her withdrawal, her refusal to engage with the world outside the confines of her chamber. And yet within her mind, Eleonora still ruled, ruling over a kingdom of illusions where her love for the statue was the highest law. Days and nights had passed without distinction. Her once beautiful garden was overrun with weeds, and the marble floors of her palace had been cracked by the weight of her descent. Her servants, those who had remained loyal, now trembled before her, too afraid to disturb her. They had all become part of her delusion, mere figures in the backdrop of her perfect, yet broken, reality. It was in this moment of solitude that Eleonora stood before her statue once more. Her hands reached out, trembling, as if caressing the stone. She whispered as she always had, "My love, my life, at last we shall be together forever." The words were as soft as a prayer, and yet they carried the weight of all the years she had spent seeking solace in the cold embrace of marble. But today was different. Today the statue did not remain still. It did not remain silent. In the depths of her madness, Eleonora believed she saw it move, a slight shifting of its posture, a subtle change in its expression. Her heart raced with excitement, a wild hope flaring within her chest. It is real. It must be real. It loves me too, just as I love it. She pressed her lips to the statue's cold cheek, desperate to feel any warmth, any response. For a moment the room seemed to pulse with the intensity of her longing. Her breath became erratic, her pulse quickening as if the very air around her were alive. But no answer came. No reply, no sign of reciprocation, just the cold, unyielding stone. Eleonora fell to her knees, her hands clutching the base of the statue. Tears poured down her face as she whispered, "Please don't leave me." She felt as though the stone itself were mocking her, refusing to give her the solace she so desperately craved. But in her heart she knew. She had always known. The statue would never love her. It was nothing more than an illusion, a reflection of her desperate yearning. She had built her world around it, a world that was fragile, doomed to collapse. And so the queen wept. She wept not only for the statue that could never return her love, but for herself, for the life she had wasted, the kingdom she had lost, and the love that had destroyed her. She had sacrificed everything for a dream that was never meant to be. She had chased a shadow until it consumed her entirely. In her final moments, as she lay there cradling the statue against her chest, she understood the truth. Her love had never been real. It had been nothing more than a reflection of her own isolation, a manifestation of her need to fill the empty space within her heart. She had been running from her own fears, her own loneliness, and in doing so, she had created a fantasy that had ultimately led her to ruin. With her last breath, the queen whispered one final thought, a question that had tormented her throughout her life. Was I ever truly loved? She And as the light of the world dimmed for Eleonora, the statue stood unmoving, silent, forever the object of her affection, forever a symbol of her tragic, unrequited love. The tragic end of Queen Eleonora is a stark reminder of the dangers of obsession and the destructive power of love that can never be returned. Her death is not just the end of a ruler, but the collapse of a fragile dream that consumed everything in its path. Was it love that killed her, or the fantasy of love that she could never truly have? You decide. You